Okay, so thank you and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this wet and windy Friday afternoon, or it might not be, depending on where you're calling in from today, so thank you. So today's webinar is around planning in a time of uncertainty. We're going to address the global and conceptual effects of external trends on UK businesses and the critical need for future planning. We're going to learn how to survive and thrive as life goes back to normal. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, who's David Beurle. He's a world-renowned strategist, a researcher and practitioner. He's also the founder and CEO of Future IQ. So you're in for a treat this afternoon for those who haven't heard David. He's an amazing speaker. I'm really looking forward to today. So can I just ask that everybody goes on mute initially? And if you've got any questions or observations, if you could use the chat function along the way, that would be fantastic. And as I said earlier, I'm recording the session, so I'll share that with you afterwards, and also some of the contact details and other materials that Future IQ has to offer. So over to you, David. I'll hand over now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty. Hello, everybody. Great to have a bit of time with you. So I wanted to just talk about the format of how I wanted to conduct this, because we've got a good sized group, like 20 people. So I think this is going to be really conducive for a discussion as opposed to me presenting at you, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just sort of set the frame a little bit with a few slides, and then share some of our thinking about what are emerging trends and how the world's kind of unfolding in a period of uncertainty. And then I'll go back to us all on the screen. We can have some discussion about, some certain elements, and then we'll go to a little bit more information, and we'll do that sort of 2 or 3 times. And that'll give us a chance, I think, to kind of explore these topics, because I'm actually really interested in a kind of a discussion about, your thoughts or reactions to how we're seeing the world and what some of our predictions might be for the future. So that'll be the format, right? And obviously we'll be done on time. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have about, 6 or 8 slides at the start, and then we'll come back to a discussion sort of format. So if I make sure this works. Right. So can you see my screen now? Okay, good. All right. So let me just talk a little bit, just set the frame a little bit here. So just a little about Future IQ as a company. So we are a research and consultancy company, and we specialize in foresight research and really future planning, essentially, is what we do, hence the name Future IQ. And we've actually almost 2 decades now, we've been working in this sort of space. Predominantly our footprints, North America, Europe and Australia, and some other places. And our clients really range right across the board, from corporations to governments to, municipalities and so on, right? So all of our work is about future planning. And I really want to kick off by just sort of framing this up by talking about the importance of future thinking. And it's sort of an interesting topic when we're in the midst of something that's really a once in a lifetime sort of crisis. We can get very distracted by the urgency of issues on our doorstep. But this sort of webinar or Zoom call, and the topic is really about how do we both manage that sort of complexity of the urgency, but also be having an eye on, well, what does this mean in the longer term, and how do we think about positioning ourselves as we go forward? And I should say that in this period of uncertainty, I'm not just talking about the pandemic. I actually, my thesis is that we are in an extended period of uncertainty. But I want to just talk a little about sort of dealing with change, because that's sort of at the root of this. And as we all know, change is really complex, right? And there are a lot of factors that drive that. And the period we're in, obviously now, but going forward, is this period of higher degree of uncertainty, which has reduced predictability about the future. So how do you plan in an intelligent manner when you have a high degree of uncertainty, reduced predictability? And for a lot of people, the emotional experience of that is it leaves people confused and wary about the future, because we don't know what's going to happen, right? And some people are facing, existential kind of issues in terms of their businesses and so on. Other people are working really fast to adapt and evolve, but there's still this kind of big period of uncertainty. But at the same time, there are some things I think we can, if we think carefully about trends, is we can anticipate certain changes that are coming and what might emerge, evolve, and what new trajectories might become possible. And that's really what I want to explore with us today as a discussion topic. Just a little background, we've done a lot of in-depth foresight research projects. So we've published these are on our website. Things like future of food, cities of the future of urban living, next industrial revolution, and so on. I mean, we're just actually fascinated by what are the converging forces across a range of topics and how they're shaping life. So I want to draw from a little of this as we go through today. At the core of our sort of planning approach is scenario planning, and we've been using that as a methodology for about 15 years, and we've developed some sort of unique iterations of that. And why we do that is that it combines sort of research, perceptions of the future, understanding of key trends, and the ability to be able to develop a series of plausible scenarios or trajectories going forward. So in a period of uncertainty, we actually don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we can at least think about there might be a range of plausible futures. And scenario planning as a methodology we've found is really effective for people to be able to think through different iterations of the future and think about the possible implications and use it as a testing ground for decision making. And how do you build sort of flexible and agile plans in a sort of a difficult environment. And this is not just our sort of opinion. I mean, this is supported by a lot of research in terms of scenario planning as a methodology that helps people, couple together a whole range of trends and changes and try and think about how it might happen. The real power of it is that it allows us to consider both trajectory, so the direction of change, and velocity, the speed of change. And I think a lot of planning I see and what we have to deal with when we're planning in periods of uncertainty is really try and get a handle on the speed of change, because that's what often gets people blindsided. But the magic of it is that the process helps alter our perception of how certain decisions may play out over time. And so it's that ability to be able to kind of game out or speculate about it. Well, if certain things happen or we take certain sort of steps, what might be the intended and unintended consequences over time? And at the same time, combining a whole range of potential trends and trying to understand those. So turning to the topic at hand, right? So that's the sort of background about future IQ and so on. So obviously the current pandemic highlights this, right? And this period of uncertainty. What we've been doing in Future IQ is we've been really trying to think through if our thesis is that we have this pandemic, but actually we are in a period of extended uncertainty, because there's a lot of other things that are coming. Things like climate change haven't gone away. Geopolitical tensions haven't gone away. Societal changes, is coming and so on. And I want to talk a bit about that. So what we've been trying to understand is in the current pandemic, but in that context, which trends are being amplified and accelerated? What changes might be more elastic? And what I mean by that is, we might see changes, but to what degree do we snap back to normal when sort of the emergency of a pandemic is over? So trying to tease apart, those things that are actually really just underlying trends that are just being amplified, accelerated, and which are those that are, we adapt, but we're going to snap back to the way we were. And where are we at with potential tipping points, right? And I want to present a little bit of information about each one of these sets of trends that we think, and then have some discussion about what the implications might be in the context of businesses and so on. So to take the first topic area, right? So which trends are being amplified and accelerated, right? So this is not the total list, of course. It is our thought about what we're seeing in terms of those key ones. One is reinvention of cities. So, I mean, obviously lockdowns, work at home, social distancing has big impact on cities, and people are looking at how cities can be reinvented, but that's actually an underlying trend. There's been, as you would all know, just an enormous amount of work being done on how to create cities as different kinds of environments. And we think that the pandemic and other things that are coming will just continue to drive the reinvention of cities. And there's a lot of innovation and a lot of business opportunity in that whole space. Another very obvious one, and there's a lot of data on this, is the application of automation and robotics. We're seeing an enormous acceleration of businesses and industries pivoting to more robotics and automation. And this is particularly where people have suddenly realized that the weakest link in the chain, or their vulnerability, is the human component in their manufacturing plant or the transportation system or whatever it is. And you can see all over the place that, everything from, logistics to food processing and so on, people are really stepping on the accelerator in terms of automation and robotics. So it's been very much amplified and accelerated. Instant health data, this is a really kind of interesting one, is I don't think I imagined that we'd see the day where, there'd be so many, heat sensors and everybody's just getting scanned everywhere they go, and, walk past scanning and all that sort of stuff. This is something I think is going to be a really interesting trend to watch in terms of instant health data, and both it's at the level of managing society, but at the level of individual information. Personal recognition and tracking. If anybody still thinks that privacy is that we have privacy, I think that game's long gone, right? Obviously, the requirements of managing pandemic will just amplify and accelerate personal recognition and tracking. And, you can look at the number of cameras that are installed and so on, and all those things, that's just a massive trend. And of course, online commerce and retail, and that's, no doubt, that's just, you can see that reflected in the share prices of companies that are involved in that. And then of course, the online side, but then the loss of the more established retail, and that's accelerating that trend. Just a couple of data points, then I want to sort of come back to a discussion. So these data points are going to underpin these points here that I've talked about. This is sort of a chart that looks at the increasing capability of digital technologies. And if you can see my mouse here or my cursor, what I really want to talk about is the implications or the impact of artificial intelligence. And so we're in 2020, and on this chart, the cumulative capacity is the vertical axis and times the horizontal. Artificial intelligence is in its early days, and it's really become possible, or the acceleration of artificial intelligence has become possible due to basically the combination of a number of converging factors. So one is the Internet of Things, cloud computing, big data, analytics and visualization, but also the understanding that computers learn in a very similar way to the human mind. And so those things have combined in the last sort of 5 years to really create an environment where artificial intelligence is going to accelerate, right? And that's really an underpinning technology of all the other things I just talked about that are here. So the reinvention of cities, the automation, robotics, instant health data. Even you can see now that artificial intelligence is being deployed to look for vaccine solutions and so on. So there's this whole world that's going to accelerate and be amplified, I think, out of this current level of uncertainty. And to put that in perspective, if you look at, when are things like, when's artificial intelligence and machines going to be better than people, right? So this is from some research that's been done at Oxford and Yale. We're talking about translating languages by 2024, folding laundries by 2020, driving trucks by 2027, and so on. But the trajectory here is really that by 2060, AI will be able to do all human tasks, at least as good, if not better than humans. So what does this mean as we go into this world of accelerating artificial intelligence? And of course, there's this whole issue about the place of humans in the workplace, or the role of humans. We've sort of been working on these digital continuums, lean continuums in manufacturing, but you start to throw in androids and advanced robotics. There's a sort of an accelerating issue here of role of humans. So I want to kind of throw this to some discussion. So these are some trends that we think are being amplified and accelerated. So and across the board, reinvention of cities, technology, health, online commerce and retail, those sort of changes. And what do we think the implications of these might be for business in the next, say, 5 years? And I'm going to just stop sharing my screen so we can kind of come together as a group. And I'm going to throw this open, right? So I know there's some kind of big chunky sort of trend lines there, right? But our observation is that these are issues that are being accelerated by the current sort of uncertainty. You know, you can look at, you know, the explosion of, you know, value, the underlying value of companies like Apple or Google or, you know, Amazon and so on. What do we think the implications of that is for the business environment in the UK and for, you know, leaders and industry groups? So let's have some discussion here. There might be something in the chat box. Let me have a quick look at that, right? So Man, I might start with you, right? So you made a comment here about, are any sectors more significantly at risk or less? So do you want to just elaborate on your comment there?
Yes, thank you. I suppose I work in education, well, actually in marketing for education. Yeah. So, you know, student recruitment, but also increasingly in other services, marketing related. But of course, the education sector, whilst in research, leading the thinking in some ways, in its operation, quite often backward looking and almost protectionist. And it's kind of understanding, as somebody who serves that sector particularly, is that, you know, we were joking, sorry, I was at a board planning meeting, I'm chair of the board, I had a board planning strategy meeting yesterday, and we were saying, actually, wouldn't we like not to be in aero, you know, supporting the aero industry at the moment? Isn't it good to be in education because it's relatively stable with a relatively mixed economy within it, with public sector, private sector funding, etc. So it's not a bad sector to be in. It's just that view of what's going to, in your view, change more radically and more quickly. And of course, there could be opportunity in that. And what's going to go, if you like, or be more protected because of the nature of what it is.
Yeah, actually, well, so I want to go through those as we go through the different sort of sections of what trends we think are going to be elastic, right? And which ones do we think we're at tipping points on? And so I want to dive more into that. But actually, education is a really interesting one. Actually, I think that's one that is elastic, right? Or I wonder how elastic it is, because, you know, a lot of people are, I don't know, in different parts of the world, you see people going back to school and then they're sent back home, and then there's online learning. And so there's an enormous, like at a level of you'd never want to deliberately design it, but at the level of a social experiment to think about how society redesigns itself or adjusts to, you know, just a massive, profound change. You know, you wonder about, and we'll talk about this at the work from home, the school from home, does the other side of the pandemic, does that snap back? Do we just go back to that system? Or is this actually a change that is going to be is it laying the ground or the tracks for a permanent change, right? And I think that's worth exploring, right? And some things are going to move faster than others. You know, obviously, I think anything that's technology based, right? That is things like the online commerce, logistics, all those ones that we talked about, or management of environments like urban environments, anything that is built around that technology base, I think is going to just have an accelerating change, because what's underneath that are those big drivers of technology, of artificial intelligence and so on, right? I think there are other things that set aside, like tourism. I want to talk about that too, tourism and food industries and so on, right? Yeah. But other thoughts in terms of what we're proposing in terms of trends that are we think are being accelerated or amplified, and what might the implications of that be? What do you think is kind of what I'm keen on, right? I mean, obviously I have my views, right? And I'm sharing those with you, but what are your thoughts?
I was going to ask something, David, just about the fact that I started to type something and realised that I sent half a question, which isn't really a question, but we're all profiled on the basis of people who bought this like to buy this, and that's a pretty old hat bit of personal profiling, but the propensity to buy seems to be what people are aiming for, which is David is going to buy a motorbike when he's 5 years older than he is. This is the type and the colour. He doesn't know it yet. So at this strategic point, I'm going to market to him. So there's a feeling that from an AI perspective, people will almost know us better than we know ourselves. How close do you think we are to that?
Well, that's predictive analytics, right? And you know, I think that's part of that world of artificial intelligence, obviously, right? And you can be terrified or you can be excited about it. Take your pick on it, right? But I think there's two things going on. There's obviously predictive analytics is really just an extension of an existing trend, which is to understand group or population, responses, right? I mean, insurance companies have been doing this stuff forever, right? How they work out your insurance premiums is based on, probabilities and historic trends and so on, right? The other part I think that ties very interesting to the predictive analytics of what our sort of behaviors might be is that and I'm going to talk about this in terms of, are we starting to enter a world of insular bubbles, right? So, we, in a world where what comes at us is informed by these technological platforms, then to a greater degree, we're being fed what we are being fed rather than we're selecting, right? And if you look at an extreme example, say take the US elections, which is a really interesting kind of dynamic going on at the moment. If you go there, there's two universes, right? There's a universe that is, either political end of the spectrum, and they have essentially their own echo chamber of narrative in their media worlds and so on, right? And so if you think about that at the level of what's the bubble we live in and what's presented to us, that kind of gets really interesting. And I think there's I think we're going to have some sort of big debates in society about this as we go forward. But I do think that predictive analytics is going to have a big impact. Part of what we're going to have to work out is how do we govern ourselves and how do we make decisions as people at different scales when we've got this kind of overlay that's quite different to what society was like 20 years ago.
Yeah, I was just thinking in relation to Martin's job, which I guess might be in student recruitment or potential student recruitment, that the predictive analytics would say is people who have parents of this age, of this origin, of this profession and job, in this geographical location, with this temperature, who have social media fingerprints like this, are likely to go to the institution that Martin's recruiting for. So therefore, that just tells them who's coming. Therefore, he knows who to go to rather than do a spray and pray type of marketing. I'm feeling that that's where we're heading. That was, I guess, where I'm coming from.
Good. So let's pick that up when we get to talk about insular bubbles, because that's a kind of a thought I hadn't really pursued, Brian. I hadn't really thought about that sort of insular bubble at the level of even down to determining what sort of institutions we end up going to and so on. But I want to keep going, build some more layers here. So I'm going to just jump back and share my screen here and go to the next page, right? So, all right. So here's some of the changes we think may be more elastic, right? And so what I mean by this is, okay, there's been sudden dramatic change because of the pandemic and all the requirements that go with that in terms of how we manage ourselves. And there's a fair bit of discussion actually at the moment about are these tipping points, or are these macro trends, or are we going to see these things upset? So my notion of elastic is, change can occur, we get stretched out, but when whatever's driving that stops, we snap back to the way we were, right? So, so here's some things that we think may be sort of elastic, right? So mass urbanization. Oh, and also I would say too that the longer the system changes, and in this case, say we're required to work from home, but the longer that system is like that, the less elastic it becomes. So the more likely we're able to evolve and adapt to a new way of operating and less inclined to go back to the way it was. So mass urbanization one, right? So there's a lot of discussion about, and there's really interesting, sort of anecdotal and actual information about, this flight of people from cities into peri-urban or rural areas. And some people are sort of saying, oh, this is the end of cities and so on. I would argue that's not the case. There certainly is. There's plenty of evidence of, that there's this kind of little bit of a fight on for homes outside cities that are, have a little bit more natural social distancing. But I think the underlying macro trend is much bigger than that. I think this is just a little bleep. There's another one that's quite interesting, I think, which is financial equality. I mean, obviously, we've been in a period where there's been this sort of growing disconnect between the haves and the have-nots, more wealth being accumulated by fewer people and so on. But now we're suddenly in this period where almost every developed country in the world basically has been paying people, some form of assistance or support in a very unprecedented manner, right? And it's become, there's this whole universal income sort of stories sort of got some legs on this. And now how elastic is that, right? And because the longer that goes, the more that people become dependent on, the more, or the harder it is to pull back from that. The working from home, and I put into this also the school sort of situation that was being addressed as the working from home, and this is a really interesting one. So how elastic will this be, right? And I don't know that we know the answers to this. There's discussion. You can look at data on the concerns in the business office sort of environment. You see report after report of big companies like Google pulling out of expansion deals in Dublin or across the UK and so on, as people work from home. But when the requirement to not social distance disappears, if I said that the right way around, do we end up going back to working in our environments, or does it become some hybrid model? The other one that's really interesting that we've been watching is the nationalism versus the globalism. So right now, obviously, we're all contained within the borders of wherever we ended up about mid-March. But prior to that, I mean, of course, global travel and globalism was accelerating every year. But now we're in a much more nationalistic type environment, both politically and in physical reality. Which of these do we think are elastic? That's kind of what I want to probe. And I just want to show you a couple of data points here. So, we've been talking about the future of urban living. Our thesis is that between 1950 and 2050, humanity is actually moving from being an agrarian rooted species to an urban dwelling species. And I think that has all sorts of implications. If you think of us now as an urban dwelling species, that has all sorts of implications about where future change might occur. And just to give you, I know a couple of you may have seen these charts, but these are from UNICEF. This is kind of a map of the world with different pockets. So you've got the United Kingdom, the US, China, and so on. This is the number of people who lived in urban environments, over 100,000 people in 1950, right? And the colours are about the percentage, but by 2020, if you go back to 1950, 2020, we have this massive expansion in almost every place in the world in terms of percent of urbanisation. But then you go through to 2050, and the world's now really, 80 to 90% of people in developed countries are living in urban environments. And I think that's a macro trend that we've been through a number of pandemics and it hasn't stopped that. We've been through SARS, we've been through other H1N1 and so on. People say, COVID's the end of cities. I don't think so, right? The data doesn't support that. The underlying macro trend is much stronger. So just let's have some discussion here about these ones, because these start to hit some of what you're talking about. Which of these do you think are elastic, and which do you think are actually game-changing trends for the future? And what are the implications of those? Would love to hear your thoughts. Who wants to dive in on that one? So we're talking about mass urbanisation, financial equality, working from home, nationalism versus globalism. Are they elastic or are they game changers?
Penelope's got her hand up. Penelope, do you want to come off mute?
I can't see Penelope. Oh, yes, okay.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, I think that, I'm just trying to figure out where my camera is. Working from home, I think, is less elastic. Certainly the feedback from my people who are all working from home is they want to stay working from home. A tiny minority of maybe 5% that don't, and they only want to come in because they're lonely and it's a bit of a social club.
Yeah. And what are the implications of that, Penelope? If you think about that, right? So if we say it's not elastic, what are the implications?
Well, there's certain implications for my costs. The building. Do I keep a building? Do I not keep a building? At the moment, I'm heating a building that's completely empty, an office building. It has implications for recruitment because it gives me the opportunity to recruit from a different demographic. Perhaps people who can't come into an office, physically disabled, they could work from home better. So I think it has positives and it has negatives, because the negative side is people don't like necessarily being trained remotely. So training is an issue. How do we manage that? But generally, it hasn't had a negative impact on my business. So I'd be okay with it. Yeah. Personally, I'm not a big fan because I can't get a feel for how the business is going. But if it works, then yeah.
It's a really interesting one too, because we've been trying to think through what might be the desirable or the undesirable intended, unintended consequences, right? So, obviously there's all sorts of implications for office space and those type of things. But if you can work from home, does that also mean you can work from anywhere? And so does it mean that, for example, we may draw our workforce from our immediate geography? Well, why aren't we using somebody in India? And I think it could have some really interesting disruptive impacts. I mean, we sort of saw the call center phenomenon, right? So think of this as call center on steroids, because you've got all the other technology that goes with it. I mean, we're having a really interesting discussion here with a group of people, and we're all sitting God knows where, right? But we're doing it through this virtual platform. If it's not elastic, it doesn't go snap back. What are the other implications in terms of business competitiveness and how we? But I also think it cascades in other ways too, which is how do we design our houses? So you see a lot of Zoom calls and somebody's sitting in the spare bedroom, or like I am in the apartment on the end of the house, or they're sitting in the landing on the stairs or somewhere. Well, if this becomes permanent, then architecturally things are going to get changed and morphed as well. And if you layer on top of that education from home, like that learning from home as well, then you start to get a different set of drivers. But good comment, Penelope. Other people, what's your perspective on the elasticity of this, or what the implications might be? I see Paul, yes.
So it's just funny because I'm sitting here in Dubai joining you all. So this is echoing the thing that everybody else is saying about, how does that increase your ability to get anybody? So I've learned for a little while personally that I can work from anywhere because I'm probably the most mobile of my team. My team have learned over this period that they can work from anywhere too. So they've been kind of pushed into that. And I find a slight difference. I was agreeing with Penelope that some of my younger team miss the social aspect. They're a little bit lonesome, having a chat and people and so forth. And some of my other members of my team that maybe have family or whatever the heck it is, they found it it's challenging because they've had to teach their kids from home and all the rest of it. But actually a delight. They've really, really enjoyed the fact that they don't spend an hour getting into work and an hour getting out of work. And my office, I have the slight problem of being both the landlord and the tenant of my business. So in my business head, I'm thinking, do I really need this property any longer? And again, I've been doing a lot of thinking about when this type of thing is great. I've heard quite a few people, and I think I sort of agree with it, that most meetings you can do like this, but there are certain strategic type ones, and maybe that's just technology waiting to catch up, that people feel they need to be with them so they can spark ideas and write things on the wall and God knows what else. So, but most people are finding that they can do a huge amount remotely. So I kind of echo that. So I agree that of all the ones you put up there, I felt this was less elastic. And I also believe that the point that you made that if this pandemic carries on for another year and we're working this way, it'll become normal. I think it's already normal for a lot of my people. But anyway, there we
go. That's and the thing that really jumped out at me, because I try and watch what are markers for what might be sort of elastic or permanent changes and so on, right? And when Google announced recently that it was assuming its workforce was going to be working from home until the end of June 2021, I thought, what do they know, right? Because that's a long way out, right? And that they are, like you say, Paul, they've basically then assumed they've got a year plus under their belt of being able to function their operation with basically almost all their staff in a work from home or work away from the office environment. Caroline, I see you made some comments there too about your clients wanting to work from home. Did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, hi. So more than 50% of them are already at the moment working from home, as I am, but I have an office at home and have worked from home for 29 years, so it's not unusual for me.
Yeah.
And also, I think working anywhere is actually what is the future. I think people can just work wherever you are. Like Paul's saying, he's in Dubai. I've got a place in Portugal. I sometimes go out there, and I have gone and worked there. Nobody knows where I am. So actually, I think we need to become even more flexible about that, and the technology is helping us do that. The other thing I've noticed is the creativity aspect, though, and that's that strategic stuff. So when teams want to come together and do their strategic, and even board meetings, because I'm on a board and we're using Microsoft Teams, that definitely lacks a little bit of that pinging ideas off with each other and that energy that you get from being with another body, another human being, because you don't have the same energy on this, even though it's a great way of exchanging views and hearing other people's opinions, etc. But I recently ran a workshop where we used the whiteboard in the background, and that helped a lot of people with what they would normally come up and put on a flip chart, and it was anonymous. And a lot of people who are a bit more introvert, which I'm not, but a lot of people who are a bit more introvert were quite happy putting their comments on because nobody could see who put the comment on. So that was interesting. So it actually enabled people who are quiet and introvert and a bit shy to really contribute fantastic thoughts without having any of the embarrassment factor that in the room they would have had, and they would have probably held back. So I'm just finding it fascinating because it is definitely changing. And I don't think there's any way we're going to go back to how we were. I think we are in a different place.
Yeah, all right. That's interesting. I think and to tie that to Paul's comment about and yours too, Caroline, about the human interaction, that there's we're used to a different dynamic when we're actually physically together. And we're kind of interested in that from our work in community visioning, right? Because there's very much a sort of a kind of a mind meld or something that happens when people are working together. But maybe technology gets us to the point faster than we think, where we have holograms and those type of things, which are technically feasible. But it's really interesting is that the divergence seems to be a lot of people seem to be like working from home is just fab, right? But far less people are keen to have their kids go to school from home. And so, and I think maybe that's just sort of outsourcing child raising or something like that, right? But I think that it'll be really interesting to watch how those different things play out, right? What, different streams or different sectors and what will happen. So I want to just flip and just go through the last few sort of slides and then sort of, have another round of discussion. Let me just dive into here. All right, so I was talking about these discussions on these, right? So the last set of trends that we want to kind of just probe and talk about and think about what the implications might be. Where do we think there are tipping points, right? And I would probably suggest that in the decade ahead of us, because we think this is going to be a period of profound change and uncertainty, that these tipping points are going to have huge implications. And I think there's less understanding about where we might go with these, right? So one is about societal values, global equality, inclusion, and collaboration. And, and we've always wrestled with, obviously, inequality globally. But there are some issues such as climate change and food and things like that that are going to really amplify some of these inequalities. And it'll be very interesting to see how the world works together, because we were on a path where there was lots of sort of collaborative approaches. We're currently in an environment where those sort of mechanisms are being tested. But what's on the other side of, say, the US election or, Brexit or whatever, what's the, where are we going to be in a few years' time? So, and are we at this tipping point where we're going to see a drive towards more nationalism, or do we think that there might be a flip where there's going to be a sort of a new era of collaboration and working together? And I want to show you some data points to talk about. The other part is this issue about humans living in insular bubbles, right? So we probed this at a sort of a think tank we did at Windsor Castle that Paul Lindop came to, which I see Paul's on the team here. and we were talking about societal evolution. If we're going to be in a world of these sort of mass urbanization mega cities, how does society evolve? Do we end up being driven into insular bubbles, or do we end up being more connected and sort of collaborative in these sort of environments? And interestingly, right now we are quite literally being driven into bubbles, right? And you know, we have our family bubble, or our, you know, how many people we can deal with, but beyond that, we do live in these virtual bubbles. You know, most people have extended deep relationships through their device, whether it be their laptop or their phone or whatever, right? And even this is we're in this sort of insular bubble on this. So what does that mean in terms of implications if humans are moving to live in these insular bubbles? Environmental awareness, and that's the sort of climate change. Does, you know, where might we be in a couple of years on that? Travel and tourism I want to hit on, because we do a little bit of work in this space, but every significant group in the tourism industry is talking about this being an opportunity for a radical transformation, right? And there are sort of two sides to that equation. There's some places and people who are just sighing a relief that the tourists have gone away, right? There are places that are particularly in the sort of the day trip around big cities are just being blasted in these sort of blast zones of people who are not traveling too far, but they're really just doing sort of almost domestic local tourism. And then of course there's the whole issue of international tourism. And then there's the transformation of the global food industry, which I want to touch on, right? So, and what might be the opportunities and implications in terms of the UK and businesses and so on there. So a couple of things that are really driving this, right? So this is the underlying kind of thesis we have, is that we are about to go into a decade of profound social change, and it's driven by, and here I have the UK population pyramids and the US ones, right? But we have these two bubbles that we know about, right? We have the baby boomer bubble and we have the millennials and so on. And we're going to see this influence shift in the next 10 years. And what does that mean in terms of societal values? That's one of the things I am most interested in. I think it's one of the things we are most underestimating is the degree to which we may see significant societal change in the next 10 years. And if you look at things like Black Lives Matter, for example, and that's really, you know, generations of you know, discontent surfacing in a very rapid way. And where does it go from here, right? If you look at the impacts of climate change, this is the ability to be able to produce food, you know, where the greens is where the forecasts are for crop yield or agricultural yields to increase in traditional agriculture, and the reds is where it's forecast to decrease as a function of climate change. And obviously, you know, most of the global population lives here, and the fastest growing parts are sort of India through sort of Middle Africa and so on. So it's creating this, setting up this incredible disconnect. And I think the figures are that, you know, over 1 billion people could be displaced because of food shortages and so on. And that's going to happen, you know, probably sooner rather than later, because most climate change things seem to be accelerating. And this ties obviously to the hunger map, to this world hunger map, where, you know, we're the same place where all these big populations are, and where, you know, ability to produce food's declining. We actually have the highest levels of intensity of hunger currently. And the other kind of data point here is, you know, this whole growth paradox, this question of, can tourism ever actually really be sustainable? And the big debate, of course, is, you know, or a big sort of movement is, how do we use this pause in tourism to think about building sustainable tourism industries? And there's probably a school of thought that tourism, as we've known it, may look very different in, you know, 5 or 10 years time. You know, and I sort of raise this because, you know, Scotland and other places do have significant exposure to the tourism industry and so on. You know, do people travel in the same way? Do centres, how do they deal with over tourism and so on? And are we at a tipping point, right? Because, you know, the pandemic almost arrived at the perfect time, because there was about to be an enormous pushback and alienation about tourism. So some discussion, right? So these are some thoughts we have in terms of where there might be significant tipping points that could be profoundly impactful on our lives and our business in the next 5 or 10 years, right? So this a macro shift in societal values where there's a new shift to global equality, inclusion and collaboration, like a real reset, right? Driven by the shared needs to deal with climate change and actually not just people are hungry, but people are starving or something like that, right? This impact of people living in insular bubbles, right? Where technology and our experience, we have less need to connect to the person next to us or in the village we live in or the community we live in, but we live in a very rich, community insular bubble. What does that mean for businesses? Environmental awareness, travel and tourism, transformation of the global food industry. I didn't say a lot about that in terms of the data point, but that's really underpinned by those shifts in the ability to be able to produce food. So, and a number of these actually are key economic drivers in the part of the world that we're talking about. So, so let's go to some discussion on these, right? What are your thoughts about, do these tipping points, right? How might they impact, what might be the implications, right? And just to reiterate, we're talking about the potential shifts in societal values, impact of humans living in these insular bubbles, awareness of macro trends around climate change and so on, travel and tourism. What are your thoughts about these macro trends? And are we at tipping points? And are there tipping points that we didn't cover in that need to be on your radar if you're planning in uncertain times? So I see Martin's made a comment here, or Caroline. Were you talking to this one, Caroline? I see there's a note on chat here. If we have left bureaucracy in process.
Sorry, yeah, that was just about, I've made a reference to the book Humanocracy, and that's Gary Hamel from Harvard, I think, has written with another guy whose name I can't remember. But actually, the more we take away the bureaucracy and process, then people can be freed up to actually lead. And we need to train them. And guess what I do? I coach and I train.
Yeah.
So that's right out my street. So people do actually we still need the leadership element, and we still need that. In fact, I think that's what's coming out more and more. So in my coaching, because that's what I do for a living, I'm finding people are really needing to connect emotionally and get that support and look at themselves differently. And so they do need leadership support. And throughout the pandemic, that's been patchy for depending on the organization and how the organization and their leadership management have coped with the crisis. So that's what I'm talking about there, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I see Celine wants to make a comment. I just want to jump in here first. Is that one of the things that is really interesting when you look at all these trends, right? Is that if we have mega cities, some of those cities are becoming bigger and more influential than states or even other forms of other jurisdictions, and we don't really have good societal decision-making processes. And one of the things that we think some of these tipping points could create, particularly a shift in societal values and so on, is sort of a reinvention of how democracy gets conducted. And I think that's sort of pointing to a little bit to what you're talking about, Caroline, which is, how do we come together and make decisions if we're living in virtual bubbles, right? So, what's happening in the house next door or the business next door to me may not be so much, there might be a different world that we're making decisions about and developing leadership and evolving. Celine, did you have your hand up? You wanted to add something? You have to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, it's when you were talking about the tipping point of insular bubbles. So my concern would be about people having people had to learn to socially distance, had to learn to work from home. So how will people learn to be together again? How will people learn to be in offices again? And what is the impact of all this on people's mental health and society as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously seeing the spike in mental health concerns with people either not coping or missing some fundamental support elements, which, so how does that happen? Is that where what Caroline's talking about in terms of, people find support in different ways in these different sort of mechanisms or bubbles? Martin's made a post here too that about talking about opposing priorities of different age groups with different values likely to be a challenge in democracies. And I think, Martin, you're damn dead right on that, right? And, you know, Brexit is the perfect example in your backyard, right? But you can look at others around the world, but that's, I mean, you've got a kind of an inverted response based on age groups, right? But what's going to happen in the next decade, of course, I think, is the influence starts to shift, right? And that's what, you know, all the demographic tracking in the big democracies in the world is looking at where that sort of tipping point occurs. And do you want to expand on what the implications might be, Martin, in terms of how we think about that in our businesses? Because, you know, because I actually, I've got to say, I work with a lot of communities where it's baby boomers designing a future for baby boomers. Because often who's at the table in a lot of those sort of decision-making exercises is not yet the emerging influential group, right? And that's what I keep prodding people and say, well, you've got to be really careful. You're not just designing, you know, a strategic plan or a community plan or industry plan through the lens that you have, because you're not going to be here in 10 years, right? It's going to be a different set of people who are going to be important. Martin, did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the feel of that, well, two elements. I think we've got, if you looked at that curve you demonstrated before from the US and the UK, obviously we've got a splurge around the baby boomers and the aging population, and also a splurge actually starting to increase again now in the youth population. And so, but very, very different views often on life, politics, you know, priorities for spend, etc. That is going to create a challenge, and it probably will be the politicians that get that harness the right groups out in their support that will probably drive the policy agenda, of whichever age group they play to, of course. The question about how this is going to play out for different companies, I think it's really important. We work in youth marketing, so we're developing our own, you know, strategic plan at the moment. And one of the things I've insisted on is a mixed group with a very strong young people from the company as part of that. You know, it's a slice through the company, so that we get everybody's views and everybody's views welcome, to try and make sure it's not that, you know, designing a world for a 60-year-old. You know, we actually obviously our primary audience is people looking like me who give us contracts. That's our audience.
Yeah, that's it.
But our audience are 15, 16, 17-year-olds for the stuff we deliver as a service. So we have to do both. We have to appeal to the people who will sign off the business, and of course, and deliver for them as a business. But of course, we have to intrinsically understand how those young people think, act, and can be engaged with. Yeah.
So good comment. So I want to just I just want to conclude, because we're kind of down on the clock, and there's a few comments, and I just want to draw these into my concluding comments, because I think we can look at the future in a couple of different ways, right? And there's going to be people across the spectrum. There's people who will be sort of concerned and terrified and wondering what the chaos is going to look like, and there are people who will be quite optimistic and thinking about how do we harness these trends to create opportunity. And I should say that historically, the optimists win out, right? And I should also just declare that I'm a complete optimist, right? But I do want to just share my screen just for a sec, because I did have a couple of thoughts I wanted to just share with you to wrap that up, right? So predictions and observations, right? And these are unashamedly our perspective, right? So in the next decade, we're going to see waves of accelerating change, societal and technological. I think that the 20s as a decade from the future looking back will look a lot like the 60s. So the 60s was defined by a period of really radical social change where power shifted in society and there was this unleashing of a new generation, right? You know, there was technology became, you know, man was going to the moon, all those kind of things. And of course, there was an enormous amount of creativity. And the work we do with young people, to me, points to that there's this sort of desire pressing up to see a lot of these big social issues of injustice be addressed, but technology be applied to find solutions for the big societal challenges, right? So I think actually we're going to see a period of accelerating change, but it's going to be very exciting if you want to embrace that, right? The other part that I think is worth reminding ourselves is that what's different probably from the 60s is that humans are now an urban dwelling species, right? And urbanization will accelerate. I think we are well past the critical tipping point, right? There's just too much in terms of our amenities, and it's not just work. I mean, we live in cities to be close to health care services, to be close to, you know, facilities and shopping, and people can now recreate. They can go out and do an easy day's recreation, and cities are becoming much more livable, right? And I think to understand that helps us think about, you know, what are our clients doing and who are our clients if we are now an urban dwelling species, right? And for the UK, you know, the UK was actually the most urbanized country in the world for a long time, right? So it's not a far reach, but it's going to be globally, you know, we're now urban dwelling. This future period, say the next 5-10 years, it's going to demand us to accelerate change or lose, right? The truth is there'll be those that fall out because they can't keep up with the change or become irrelevant much faster than we used to become irrelevant. And of course, planning is going to require flexible, well-informed plans, but grounded in understanding trends that can be adapted fast. So they were just my concluding comments. So we're bumping up against the time here, Kirsty. So I wanted to just hand it back to you, and I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, too, for your comments. I think these conversations are just so interesting in this period, right, where we get a chance to come together in ways we didn't before, to kind of to reflect on and speculate about and be able to sort of think about how do we chart our path forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I know Celine and I were very excited to be sort of preparing and setting up for this, and hope it was of some value to you, of course, right? But Kirsty, can I hand that back to you now to wrap this up for us?
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. And thanks everybody as well on behalf of the IOD for engaging with us and sharing your thoughts. And I'll share a lot of David's materials, and I would encourage you to have a look at some of this research and to connect with Celine and David, who I know would be happy to speak to you. So thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your time, and look forward to you joining us hopefully next week. We've got a whole new range of webinars and a whole vast range of subjects. And thanks again for your time, and have a lovely weekend when it comes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.